Radio for the masses.
Headline edition, July 8, 1947. The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army.
If the game is rigged, change the game. Game changer.
I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world.
This is Fade to Black with your host, Jimmy Church, on the Game Changer Radio Network.
All right. Good evening, Fade to Black. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. Today is May 1st. It is a Monday, and tonight's broadcast is brought to you by Accidental Truth. It is streaming right now, and it is like a hit. Streaming right now on all of those streaming services. You can go and rent and purchase the film now. Accidental Truth. The links are below. And I'm going to say it. I'm going to say it again. My 8 seconds in this film makes the movie. It's won all the awards because of my 8 seconds. I kid. It's a great movie. It's a documentary that our entire community is now required to watch. So the links are below. Accidental Truth. Our guest tonight, all the way from Queensland, Australia, Paul Wallis is with us. We're going to be talking about tonight two of my favorite subjects that combine into one, ET contact in the Bible. We're going to be getting into some forgotten secrets about human progress, political power, emotional intelligence, and human potential. All of the things that I enjoy talking about every single night here on Fade to Black. And before I get into a really long bio for Paul, I'm not going to do that. I want to get straight to the show. But he is known for the Eden series, his best-selling series of titles in paleocontact, endorsed by George Noory and Erich von Daniken. His interviews and documentaries on the Paul Wallis Channel and The Fifth Kind and El Quinto Tipo are watched by millions worldwide. And I would like to welcome, for the first time, I've been waiting for this, to Fade to Black, Paul Wallis. There he is. Right there, Paul. Welcome, man. How you doing?
G'day, Jimmy. I'm fantastic, and all the better for being with you today. Thanks so much for having me on.
Man, this is great. And now, okay, before we get started, let's get the first-time guest disclaimer out of the way. All right, so let's do that. The next time you're on the show, you don't get it, but you get it tonight, Paul, which is it's just you and I sitting on my couch having a conversation as friends. And where that conversation starts, it starts, and where it ends, but we're going to end as friends. There you go. Approve, agree.
That's a good plan.
Yeah. All right. So I saw in the chat, and you and I were talking about this right before the show. I saw in the chat, happy birthday, Paul. And I replied back, is it today? Is it tomorrow? I'm always confused with this because he's a time traveler. So
yes, I'm in the future.
Yes. So was it last week? Is it today? Is it tomorrow? And happy birthday.
Well, thanks, Jimmy. My birthday is the 29th of April. So unfortunately, everyone's missed it, other than those who've already commented. But I am in the future, being in Australia. It's Tuesday where I am. So yeah, there you are.
So crazy to me. I don't want to sound naive. Or, no, dumb is the word. I don't want to sound dumb, but is it possible for me to jump on a plane, fly to Australia, celebrate my birthday, and then turn around and fly back to Los Angeles and celebrate my birthday a second time on the same day?
With a very fast plane, I'm sure that's possible. I haven't checked it out. It's not something I've tried, but next time we speak, I'll be able to confirm.
Yeah, I mean, you know, like I've just wondered about that.
It's a great idea. I mean, when we had Concorde, it was possible to leave London and arrive in New York slightly before when you left London. So that's a treat we've missed, but hopefully it'll be coming back again before too long.
Now, what if you just kept going? Right, and he ended up in 1962. Right, I don't know.
That would be fascinating.
I haven't figured this stuff out yet. But anyway, welcome to the show. It's great to have you here.
Thank you.
And we have so many different areas and zones that we can go into. But I'm going to start off with the obvious question. This is a subject that I think a lot of people now are starting to recognize and talk about. But it wasn't the case 20 years ago. It wasn't the case 5 years ago. When did you first start to dive into this part of reality?
I first started a deep dive into it around 5 years ago as I was on the research path for my first book of paleocontact, Escaping from Eden. But it had been in the back of my mind for a long time. I was 11 years old when my mum and dad introduced me to Erich von Daniken. And so he had been in my mind since that time, just pointing out that we have difficulty explaining ourselves as a species without allowing for the possibility of external interventions to nudge our development along. And I knew that Erich had begun his journey in the world of theology, in the world of Bible translation. That's what got him onto the path of paleocontact. So that was in my mind. And then in 2009, Pope Benedict XVI, the most conservative pope in my lifetime, called on the Pontifical Academy of Sciences to discuss the theological implications of contact with other civilizations. That got my attention because it was only 400 years ago the same institution was burning people alive for merely suggesting there might be intelligent life on other planets. And the way that whole event was prefaced and the way his spokespeople met the press afterwards gave the impression that the Vatican was expecting some kind of disclosure to be made by some other authority, and they wanted to get in there first. And those were the two things that made me think there's something I really need to get to the bottom of. One of the Pope's spokesmen, it was the senior astronomer at the Vatican Observatory, Reverend Dr. Guy Consolmagno, said we shouldn't be surprised to encounter aliens because they're in the Bible. They're in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. And when he said that, he put out a great challenge to believers and theologians all around the world to go back to the Bible and have another look and work out, are there aliens in the Bible? And I thought, I have to take that challenge up. Someone is going to write that book, and I want it to be me because I know there's something there that we haven't quite named.
Was it a surprise to you to find out that we all know what heresy meant, 300, 400, 500 years ago? It was a dark area. And if you were bringing up the sun and the moon and earth and what may be going on out there, you had a very short lifespan. It's just a fact. And today the Vatican is funding their own observatories, right? It's like, wait a minute here. And when you started to find out about the Vatican's fascination with the universe and what was going on, what went through your mind? Does that verify and vilify those in the past, and including up to Erich von Daniken?
Well, there has clearly been a big shift because we've gone from burning people at the stake, people like Giordano Bruno, who talked about life elsewhere in the cosmos, or putting people like Galileo under house arrest for the rest of his life for talking about a different model of the solar system, to a couple of years ago, Pope Francis sent birthday greetings honoring Erich von Daniken. So something has changed. And I certainly knew that there was material to be dealt with in the Bible that would suggest a populated universe, but I was intrigued to see what has made the shift. Why have they made that change? And as I say, back in 2009, I felt it was because they believed other authorities were going to do some kind of a disclosure, and this was forcing them to change gear. But I think there's a pastoral reason for it as well. I think there are enough people in the know in the Vatican, people who know that close encounters are a real phenomenon, people who know that ufology is something real, that we are in contact. There are enough people in the know to be saying we need to prepare the faithful for this, so that if it becomes blindingly obvious that we're in contact, it doesn't blow our whole ship out of the water. we need to show that we've got room in our theology to accommodate a populated universe. And so I think there was a pastoral reason behind it as well, of saying we might need to disclose a little bit more just for the sake of helping the faithful do business with new information.
There is the obvious question that everybody in the community wants to know the answer to. And I don't know if this is in or out of your wheelhouse, but certainly you have an opinion. Does the Vatican know? Are they sitting on those secrets of contact with ET?
Short answer, yes. They know for a number of reasons. Firstly, they know through pastoral experience. So we have the Vatican senior advisor in the paranormal, which is Monsignor Corrado Balducci, speaking openly, saying that people who experience close encounters are not reporting a demonic phenomenon or a psychological episode, psychiatric breakdown. They are describing a totally different kind of entity, one that merits serious study. So we know that they know pastorally that people are having contact experiences. We also know that at an elite theological level, there are plenty of scholars in the Roman Catholic world who know that there are ETs in the Bible, because I've been in conversation with them. And because from time to time, they do write things in very small print in the footnotes of Bibles, letting you know that something else is going on in this text. So they know for that reason as well. Third reason they know is that for centuries, as Catholic countries have gone in conquering other people's countries, they have requisitioned, sequestered technology, texts, artifacts that strongly suggest previous civilizations and ET contact. And those objects have been taken from those countries. And I'm in particular thinking about the invasions of Central and South America. And they find their way to the European courts of Spain and Portugal and the Vatican. We know that because of the leakage that there's been in the centuries since, the leakage of information that's come from sources that only existed for a while in the Vatican Library. So for all those reasons, yes, the Vatican knows.
When I was a kid, hang on. When I was a kid, 21, all right, 40 years ago, I did this on my own, but I read the Bible. I'm not going to go through the story. It's whatever. Everybody's got this story. But I decided to read it as a novel. Okay. I hadn't done it. Started Genesis and start pounding the pages. I got to the end and flipped the book over and started it over. And on my own, at the age of 21, right in there, I said to myself, if we insert the word aliens, we've got us a good movie here. And I did that all on my own, Paul. And it was later, because it wasn't like I'm a genius. It's that it's kind of obvious. And I wasn't the only one. And in your Eden books, this is exactly what you write about, right?
That's exactly right. And you don't need to insert any words that aren't there to get the alien story. What I argue in the Eden series is all you need to do is go to the root meanings of key words. Go to the root meaning of Elohim, which is the earliest word in the Bible that gets translated sometimes as God, sometimes as demons, sometimes as landlords. What's going on with that word? So I drill down into the root meanings of Elohim, El Elyon, El Shaddai, Yahweh, Olam, Kavod, Ruach. If all you do is go to the etymology of those words and reread the stories, it becomes obvious you are reading stories of ancient ET contact. And in my latest book, The Eden Conspiracy, I say you don't even have to do that. You can leave all those words untranslated and then just look at what happens in the story. Right. And it's stories of invasion, it's stories of colonization, it's stories of non-human beings debating over what to do with Project Earth. So it really is a story that's hidden in plain sight.
I've got friends that are serious biblical scholars, right? They can quote anything and stuff. And they will say, it's pretty good science fiction if you really read it, right? They will admit to that. It's really, really well written and very clear. And do you think that our level of understanding, being able to understand and comprehend today is better? So we now can look at the Bible with that set of eyes without really any nudging or assistance?
Definitely. I think anyone who's seen a launch of the space shuttle or watched footage of a Saturn V launch will find it very easy to recognize similar phenomena in the Bible. So when you get to Exodus 33 and you've got a description of a pillar with a cloud and fire that can take off vertically and land vertically and will shake the ground as it does, and you have to clear the territory for a wide area so that people aren't killed by the blast, we recognize immediately what that is talking about. When another text, in 2 Kings, for instance, says that there was a hole in the sky and then a craft came through that hole with fire and smoke and landed on the planet's surface, we have a framework by which to understand that. Or a hole in the sky and beings ascending into the sky and descending down onto the earth's surface. This is Jacob's description of what happened at Bethel. We understand that. When Ezekiel says that he's in a capsule that is driven by an engine that is powering rotors, we think helicopter, we think drone. But for centuries, there were translators who had never seen a rocket launch, didn't know what a wormhole was, didn't know what a helicopter or a drone was. And so when they came to those texts, they really struggled to express what they were reading in the Hebrew. But the wonder of the Bible is that we still have the ancient Hebrew texts. We can go back to them. We can go back to the root meanings. We can reread the stories and say, oh my goodness, I think I know what I'm looking at here. I'm looking at a close encounter. I'm looking at an extraterrestrial entity. I'm looking at what we would call artificial insemination. I'm looking at a hybridization program. We have the language for it. And so it's probably long overdue that we go back to the texts and retranslate them, because we have an understanding now that matches what our ancestors wanted to tell us and show us, but which has been obscured for centuries by translations produced by people who'd never seen or imagined these things.
Do you focus on, because I can go in both directions, but do you focus on the Old Testament? Do you focus on the Hebrew side of things, or do you or do you place more focus on the New Testament?
Well, in my books, in the Eden series so far, I've majored on the Hebrew canon, what we call the Old Testament, because there is an amazing range of stories of ET contact, and they're told really openly. Not only do we have the record of the experiences and the encounters and the periods of history where we were governed by non-human entities, but the Bible itself tells us about when that narrative was changed and suppressed to change the focus of the people of Israel onto worship and obedience of the ultimate God. And they wanted all those other stories forgotten. Even that change and suppression is there in the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures. So I've focused on that, but I do touch on the New Testament as well, because when you reread those old stories, it reframes how you understand what happens in the Gospels and New Testament. And you begin to recognize there is an ET layer to those stories as well.
Now, and we are talking about, we're going to back up here, but staying here for a second, if we can, Paul. How much time difference are we talking about? Because, and you're the scholar here. I'm not. I'm just a dude on a microphone. Okay. So I just pretend to be smart. But if we have the 300 AD version of the Bible, right? Whenever that big meeting happened, and then the translations of those books, which happened around 100 to 150 AD, that were originally written in Greek, right? So that's after Jesus left the earth and came back. And then we go to the Old Testament and those texts. How much time are we talking about here? Is it 1,000 years in between them or more?
Well, the The Old Testament, as we know it, was really forming in the 6th century BCE, and that was when the change of the narratives was completed.
Correct.
We had an Old Testament that now appeared to be all about God. And the stories of ET contact were slightly harder to spot, but they're all still there. So that's the 6th century BCE. And then you get to year dot. And really from about 100 AD onwards, you had a kaleidoscope of texts representing the new Christian tradition. And it was a kaleidoscope of experiences and ideas and theologies. And that gradually got narrowed down to the official canon, really from the 300s on. So you've got, yes, a 8 to 900 year period between those 2 points. But all the while, of course, you do have powers who are wanting to control the narrative, who are wanting to say, our religion is about this, our religion is about that, and it's not about those other things. But by the time you get to the end of the 300s, Christian orthodoxy has really been nailed down, and the ET narratives that the early church fathers had spotted were no longer to be talked about, and it had become an enormous taboo.
So the time, I'm about right, and I'm not saying that because I'm patting myself on the back. It's because I'm heading this into a direction. So if we're at 300 AD, then we have 100 AD, and then we go back to 600 BC when things started to officially get written down. Those things at 600 BC are from an oral tradition and a history that spans a few thousand years before that, right?
Yes, you've got oral tradition, but you do also have written texts prior to the 6th century BCE that had carried the memory of earlier generations and the ancestors of the tribes of Israel. So they were written texts, but they were worked together into a single book and then re-edited to tell a more harmonious seeming story.
And those ancient texts were Egyptian, Sumerian, and Hebrew?
Well, the roots really were Sumerian.
Right.
So the earliest stories would be the stories of beginnings that you can find in Genesis 1 to 11, and they would represent really the Abrahamic tradition. So the idea that Abraham and Sarah grew up in a Sumerian-based culture, and then they moved to establish their own tradition, and they sewed into their tradition all the stories of beginnings with which they had grown up, and they wrote a summary form of them. Let's put it that way. We can tell the story that way. And certainly when you read Genesis 1 to 11, you can see it is a summary form of the ancient Sumerian stories that can be found in that culture, ancient Babylonia, Arcadia, and Assyria. However, we didn't know that until the 1800s, when finally we could translate the couple of 100,000 cuneiform tablets that we dug up from those ancient cultures. We didn't know what was on them. We didn't even know it was a language until the 1800s. And as soon as George Smith gets down and translates them using the translation they'd found, the Behistun inscription, he recognized all the source narratives that produced the stories we're familiar with in the Bible. So that's the roots of the biblical stories to be found in ancient Sumeria. And it's when you read the stories alongside each other, that's like taking the red pill in the Matrix. Suddenly, you can never read the Bible in the old way again, because you realize the Elohim stories and many of the Yahweh stories too are based on the Sumerian stories of sky people. And we have a word for sky people today, and it's ETs.
Yeah. Astronauts. ET.
Astronauts, that's right.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this isn't too far out of left field. But if we look at, well, let's just say people like me, the fringe, right? Like you. So we've been screaming about this for a very long time, about knowledge existing before 3000 BC, before Mesopotamia, and before Giza. And if we look at the Bible and its timing of things, it's saying the same things that not only our community has been talking about, but now other things that have been put forward lately, that there was a high technology situation that existed 10,000 BC, 12,000 BC. We have Göbekli Tepe today. But
Yes.
that being said, everything didn't start at 3000 BC. If we take the Bible literally, then we had culturally advanced civilization and cultures around the world way before 3000 BC, and the Bible says it's so.
Yes, it does. And again, root meanings gets you there. So if you go to Genesis 11, for instance, Genesis 10 and 11, first of all, we're told something very odd. It says that there was a time when the land of the earth had a single coastline. Now, that gets translated often as a single language and a single lip. And the two words are put alongside each other as if they're saying the same things. But there are two things we're being told in that text by root meanings. One is that all the people spoke the same language, and the other is that all the land was joined up. You think, wait a minute, that's not the story of Homo sapiens. The land was never joined up in human history, was it? And then just prior to that, in the previous chapter, it says it was in the generation of Peleg that the lands separated, that the continents separated. So here we've got a reference to a civilization that predates everything we know about Homo sapiens. Is it true? Well, we wouldn't know through archaeology, because anything from that time would be ground to a powder by this point. This was what was studied in the Silurian hypothesis. But we have texts saying it was so. What do we do with that? And then get into Genesis 11, and you read that alongside the Sumerian. When you get to the Tower of Babel, you realize you're reading about either a launch pad or a stargate. This was the place where people left the planet to get to space stations, is what the texts say. So that is a previous, advanced, spacefaring civilization that in Genesis 11 gets bombed back into a pre-Stone Age state. And I argue in Escaping from Eden that by the time you get there, Genesis 11, you probably read about 5 planetary resets in the texts. And as I said earlier, how would we know? Well, we would know if we were in contact with others who had curated those stories for us and were telling us what was what. And we might know from survivors of more recent cataclysms, which is something referenced by Plato, for instance, when he introduces the story of Atlantis. But it's there in the Bible. Successive civilizations on planet Earth doesn't often get preached on that way, but it is all there waiting to be spotted and the dots to be joined.
Spaceship lands on the White House lawn. Jesus steps off and says, "I'm back." Are you surprised?
Am I surprised? I would not be surprised, because that is certainly one way you can read the Ascension story that's recorded for us in the New Testament. It says that the story of Jesus, as far as his ministry in and around Jerusalem was concerned, that ministry ended after he had been resurrected or survived the cross, and then he got taken up into the sky in front of all of us, in front of all these eyewitnesses. Well, you know, in the past, how would you picture that? You would picture that as his body being lifted up into the heavens. Well, we now know he's going to run out of oxygen pretty quickly if it's done that way. And you can read it another way. He was taken up into the sky in exactly the same way that other eyewitnesses have described it through the ages. Taken up in a craft, same way Elijah was, same way Ezekiel was. And if it was taken up that way, maybe he could come back that way. Maybe he would land on the White House lawn. Maybe he'd come to Canberra, the capital of Australia, instead. Let's not make assumptions.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, you're right.
No, maybe I wouldn't be too surprised.
It wouldn't be the Vatican, though. Vatican's right out. That's not going to happen. But so if we look at it this way, the leaders of towns, of villages, of groups of people, of tribes in ancient times could not go back to town and say, I was just hanging out with ET and he says, don't drink the water. You can't do that, right? You've got to come back to town and go, God said, don't drink the water. And the town would understand that. So it turns into a belief system, a religion. Yes. Today, with what you are suggesting here, is this also a belief system and a religion? If you understand the same context from ancient history, if we are to believe a belief system in ET and contact, is this a new version of religion?
People do say that, but I don't think that's a helpful way to see it. When I think of religion, I think of something that's not just a system of beliefs telling people what to believe, but it sort of tells people what to do as well. And it's one of the reasons I love the ancient Sumerian texts, because they are not the texts of any religion in the world. And those texts are not there to tell anybody what to do. They are simply reports of what happened. And I think many of our sacred texts around the world are much more like that than we generally think. That many of our ancient texts are describing experiences rather than saying, thou shalt do this, thou shalt not do that. I think the problem with seeing it as a religion is that you then start to empower new elites, new priesthoods, people who know what's what, who tell you what's right and what's wrong and what to believe. And it's actually a very democratizing thing to discover these ancient texts. And I hear from people every week who've read my books and they say, this is what I've always thought. This is what I've always seen in the Bible for myself. Mm-hmm. And now I feel I've got permission to say it. So it's actually a very liberating thing of people saying, I've always seen this. I've always thought that, without having to be told by an authority.
Now we're talking about science. That's what we're talking about here, right? We're talking about science. And so much is out there from different scientists. I'm not talking about Newton, who was a very religious man and very open-minded, very smart. But today there's a hard line in the sand with physicists and scientists with, the religious beliefs or the supernatural, the paranormal. It doesn't matter, consciousness, right? And if this all comes to pass, it's going to be the scientists, those atheists out there, that are going to be the most spiritual.
Oh, yes, there'll be a lot of change and a lot of reframing to happen if we're suddenly in an era of disclosure. But there are pockets of science that wouldn't be too surprised. I mean, after all, it is scientists and technicians who put together the European Space Agency's mission to test the theory of panspermia. That's the theory that life on Earth came from off-planet, and that the genetic coding for biological conscious life is endemic throughout the cosmos. So a lot of scientists had to be involved in putting those projects together to test for that. If you spend time with DNA scientists, you'll find a lot of people who hold to panspermia because they would argue the time frame of the planet isn't long enough for DNA to have formed randomly. And then you go to some deep experts in genetic coding, to Maxim Makukov, Vladimir Sherbak. They're from the Fezenkov Astrophysical Institute and the Kazakh Al-Farabi National University, top authorities in DNA research. And they'll tell you it's not just the time frame, it's the structure of DNA itself that tells you there's been some intelligence behind what landed on our planet and resulted in all the life on Earth. You can go to other fields of science as well. Go to neuroscience. Meet the scientists who study acquired savant syndrome, and they will tell you about this syndrome where higher cognitive abilities can be knocked on by accident because our brains have higher cognitive abilities in the off position. And our conventional evolutionary theory cannot explain that. But ancestral stories that talk about ET interventions in our development, that storyline matches perfectly what our neuroscientists are discovering. So there are pockets of scientists ready to jump up and say, I told you so. And then there'll be others who might be having to recant all their textbooks, of course.
Yeah, that's going to be a difficult thing because so many there are rock star personalities out there, very intelligent people, right? I'm not here to name names, but atheists. And technically I'm an atheist, right? Okay, so I don't mean it in a derogatory way, but they will say that DNA and consciousness is just random luck. All right, it's just like wait, stop with that. That and literally because they don't want to offend their fan base, Paul, right? And they've got legions of these followers, and they can't go with some kind of intelligent design or something else going on here. But the numbers just don't add up. It's a mathematical thing. The odds of DNA creating itself because of a lightning bolt that hit a crystal in a creek bed, and suddenly DNA just appeared on planet Earth. It doesn't work that way, does it?
No, it doesn't. And in fact, Vladimir Sherbak and Maxim Kukov in 2013 produced their research showing that the chance of it happening randomly, these patterns in our DNA, is 1 in 10 trillion. So that means it didn't happen randomly, to put it in layman's terms. And yes, I think, the really strong atheist might have a problem with that, except maybe they just need to be more focused on what they know. I'm quite happy for them to be atheists in the sense that they are rejecting a particular explanation of the universe or a particular explanation of God, but they're actually hiding from certain facts like that information in our DNA. If they want to maintain a view that there's nothing beyond this planet, there's no intelligence beyond us, that then stops being science and it starts being something else.
Yeah, that's right. And why are they, and we're going to circle back to the Bible, everybody, just relax. But why the denial of an interest in consciousness?
I don't know. It's getting harder to avoid, of course, the longer we have quantum physics as part of the world of physics, because the place of consciousness has been sort of rediscovered in that field of study. I think if enough study is allowed on near-death experiences, so people who flatline, have experiences while they're flatlined and then return, the more data we have of that kind raises more interesting questions about what consciousness is and how it's supported and how it relates to this material life. We need to do a lot of science on that. But I think to have very strong pronouncements on the nature of consciousness without an appeal to data, well, that's just embarrassing. That is not science.
Is it because they can't measure it, right? They can't perform a lab experiment and they can't turn this into numbers. Therefore, it's a waste of time.
Yes, I think that is it. And not wanting to be rude, but there are people who are very comfortable in the world of maths and numbers, and anything that's less controllable, replicatable, anything outside of the modern scientific method, they get very anxious about. And that, frankly, might be an emotional intelligence issue that we need to embrace and say there's a whole load of territory where we have to go, where we can't bring our worldview that says there's nothing beyond matter and mathematics. We have to look at other kinds of data and then process it together. It doesn't mean that we lose our rational thought. It doesn't mean that we stop being critical thinkers. It just says we're willing to look at other data.
Now, if we go to Newton and before, I think that's a very critical time, actually, 300-400 years ago when some will say, the real science started, right? But Newton was a hermeticist. He was an alchemist. He was a religious scholar. He was a mathematician. He was an astronomer. He was a physicist. His math we still use today. He was a very profound individual. And before him, it was okay to be a philosopher and a scientist and call yourself a physicist and mathematician and a religious person. And it drove the thoughts of consciousness all the way back to the dawn of man. That's the way things worked. Why did that stop? It seemed like the ancients really had it together.
Yes, they did. And I mean, what you've described is the Renaissance man, the man who studies the whole of reality, the man who can do science and philosophy and see it as part of studying nature. This was really the gift of Hermeticism, that there was no separation between these fields. It was all an attempt to understand what reality is and how it works. Why that broke down, that's a really good question. But certainly it was a time when religious authorities were fighting for control of the narrative. And they did shut down a lot of leading thinkers in that time. You know, people arrested, placed under house arrest, burned alive in the most horrible ways. I mean, that was a very strong signal for the next generation not to muck up the narrative. And so when you had someone like Ficino, who had set up his university studying all these different fields, the religious authorities didn't want a joined up picture, and they shut that university down. So I think that was part of the problem, that this was about managing information, controlling the narrative, and you couldn't have individuals who are experts on everything, because that was the church's job. So I think that was a big part of it, but there was a worldview shift going on as well, because with advances in science came the growth of something called scientism, which is the idea that you can't talk about anything as fact outside the realm of science. And that, of course, led up to the culture wars of the 1800s, with Christians retreating into their world and others into their worlds. And that's probably when the great separation occurred. And it gave birth to new movements of people hungry and thirsty to study the whole of life, but from a scientific start point. And so that's when people like Blavatsky appear and start doing their work, attempting to really get a grip on non-material, spiritual phenomena, but using the language of science to do it. So it's a pretty long, complex story, but I would love us to get back to that place where we say we are interested in the whole of it. We're interested in all of it. We're interested in science, consciousness, the material, the immaterial. And my great hero in this is Plato. Plato is widely acknowledged as one of the greatest thinkers of all time. There was a British mathematician who said famously that the whole of the Western tradition of philosophy could be regarded as no more than a series of footnotes to Plato. And nobody disagreed with him. That's how great Plato was. And he was a person who was willing to say, I have science, conclusions I've reached through logic applied to things we can all observe. I have information from altered states of consciousness. I have information from contact experiences and from ancient ancestral narratives and the survivors of previous civilizations. He was able to say all of that and put that in his writings as part of a view of everything. And I think there is a new hunger for a view of everything that doesn't compartmentalize, that gets the whole picture, because we want to know who we are and what's possible for human beings. And you need that global view to answer questions like that.
When you think about, and I agree with you about Plato. Oh, 2 points about that. One, Plato gave full credit to ancient Egyptians and ancient Egypt for his views of philosophy.
Yes, he did.
And there was a few other Greek philosophers at that time too, as well, that gave credit where credit was due. But I always like that part about Plato. That's point number one. Number two,
yes,
Plato's cave. We're talking about 400 BC here. And to talk about, and it makes you wonder what he knew and what he saw for him to put those ideas. He didn't have the ability to go watch some Marvel movie, right? Some Doctor Strange movie. He's talking about multi-worlds. He's talking about parallel worlds, alternate, interdimensia. He is talking about a deep philosophical narrative, right?
Yes,
and
he is.
He did that at 400 BC. Where does he get these ideas unless there was something for him to write about?
Yes, well, I mean, he had a framework that he got from ancient Egypt via the Greek legislator Solon, who is a real historical person. And there's plenty of language in Plato that suggests Eastern thought, Indian thought, maybe via Egypt, maybe directly. But he's also very open that he has become convinced of these things. And he says, these are things I concluded but cannot prove. But he says he's become convinced of them through the Eleusinian mysteries. And that means an altered state of consciousness that enabled him to communicate with beings in other dimensions.
Yep.
Now, he says this absolutely openly in his books. What amazes me is that I read those books in my 20s as my training to become a priest in the Church of England, and somehow I missed all those juicy bits. And I think what it was is we were given handouts on Plato that were the bits relevant to the formation of Christian theology, and all these bits about psychoaffective tea ceremonies were left off the handouts. So I had to go back to Plato and rediscover all this and say, how have we forgotten this? And how have we become so coy and embarrassed about talking about this kind of information all these centuries later, when it was part of mainstream conversation 2,500 years ago?
That's exactly right. I did the same thing. And when you read today, especially now, in 2023, where we're a little smarter than we were 100 years ago, a lot smarter in our ability to understand and to comprehend, right? And think through.
Yes.
You read Plato today, and all you got to do is 400 BC. What? Right? That's what you do.
Yeah.
We're talking about 2,400 years ago,
Yeah.
a belief system and a study system that was already based on teachings and stuff that was learned from before. So it reaches
From before, that's right, from a previous culture, previous civilization. And he openly references that. He said the Egyptians got this from the survivors of Atlantis, the previous civilization. Again, unembarrassed. Today, you mentioned Atlantis, and people roll their eyes at you. But this is where he got what he regarded as solid information from.
Now, before we head to the break, you made a really good point that the Sumerian texts were not about a sales pitch, right? It wasn't a sales pitch. It was a newspaper, right? It was documenting things.
Yes.
If that is the case, and I agree, of course, but if that is the case, what were they basing it on? Were they basing it on eyewitness stuff? Were they basing it on because it may stretch, depends on how you want to translate this, anywhere from 5 to 10 to 2 to 400,000 years of time of history. So
Yes.
what do you think it was based on?
That's a really good question, because the texts that we find from ancient Sumeria, Babylonia, Arcadia, and Assyria are from a certain period in time. We can date that. But when we read the codices, the forwards to these pieces of literature, it makes clear that these are stories that go back way into the deep past, way prior to the Sumerian civilization. And I think you're right that some of the stories do touch upon interventions that were perhaps 200,000 years ago. And so the development of Homo sapiens, as we know ourselves to be, is a very long story with a number of interventions. I certainly believe there was one 200,000 years ago by visitors who wanted to use us as a workforce. I believe there's strong archaeological evidence for mining in that time. Now, that's at a time when our ancestors looked similar to us, but they weren't as clever as us. They weren't clever enough to create a farm, but they were clever enough to work in someone else's mine. And then there's clearly another intervention around 10,000 years ago, I argue, in Escaping from Eden, which lifted us from that level to knowing how to farm, knowing how to do animal husbandry, And now we can have surpluses, specialize, build cities, become a civilization. I would suggest there's another intervention around 60,000 years ago that Native Americans and Aboriginal Australians speak about, another lesson in agronomy, but on a different model to the one we were provided with 10,000 years ago. So those are just 3 examples of interventions, and those stories are all embedded in the Sumerian story. And the codices, the introductions, make clear that this is a library of memory from the deep past that they are now curating in their own cultural library.
Anthropologists will tell you that Homo sapiens sapien is about 200,000 years old on the far side of things. They don't really even push it to 300,000, right? They're kind of fixed on this 200,000 number. The Sumerian texts point to genetic modification 200,000 years ago. Now you've got the scientific camp, and then you've got us, right? The 2 camps that are completely separated, coming up with the same exact number. The fact,
yes, it's suspicious, isn't it?
It is. You think, and you know the missing link, that the proverbial missing link has never been found, and the changes that if we just go with the forehead, right? Just the forehead and the nose. Forget about the skin and hair and bone structure and all. Okay, all right. But if we just go with that glorious forehead that we have, that's hundreds of millions of years of evolution that apparently happened overnight, 200,000 years ago. Is the Sumerian text correct?
Yes, I think you're right. There is that correlation of information from science and from ancient texts that says 200,000 years ago, and there's also an agreement around 10,000 years ago as well. So that's a bit of a smoking gun, those correlations. But you know, the whole of evolution as a theory has a challenge in that what the fossil record shows is a succession of coherent functional creatures. So it's not just our forehead that appears like that. You have whole life forms that appear like that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where we go back to the intelligence in the DNA, because if you talk to evolutionary scientists today and ask for an explanation of this succession of coherent animals, sometimes with quite complex systems that you couldn't develop in stages, the whole system has to be there in one fell swoop. The answer to how that happens is, well, there are codes that belong together to produce that respiratory system, or that kind of skin, or that kind of fish-shaped tail, or whatever it is you're looking for. And so when we hear the language of groups of codes that belong together, it's very difficult to separate that from a concept of intelligence. But still the effort is made to deny that there's that connection. So it's not just a problem with humanity, it's a problem with all life on Earth. But I find interesting the correlations that you mentioned and the narratives that, if you think about it, the stories about us being engineered as a slave species, who does that glorify? Why would you invent that story? It doesn't glorify us or our ancestors, doesn't glorify our visitors. What I believe when I find the correlations from culture to culture is that every culture around the world has remembered that because it was a traumatic experience. And the stories that overlap from culture to culture are the stories of these shifts and changes that were very important in human development, but that were quite traumatic to experience. And that's why there's this fusion of what we've remembered and what we've forgotten, and why we have to piece that picture back together.
Do we have a few? I'm so glad you said that. Do we have a few different pictures we need to piece together? We have the contiguous Earth in the Bible, number 1. 2, we have Atlantis. 3, we have Sumerian texts, and all suggesting an ancient civilization and an ancient past that we don't recognize today. But also the 3 don't necessarily fit together into one story, or do they? Is there a way to stitch them together?
People often ask me this, can I give them a really detailed timeline that pins everything down and ties all the stories together? And the answer is no, I can't really. I think what I can say is the coherent picture that emerges is that life on Earth is much older than we thought, and civilization on Earth is much older than we thought, and interventions in our development far more numerous than we may have thought. I think beyond that, it's very difficult to pin down a precise timeline, but it's quite enough of a leap for most of us to realize that Homo sapiens might not be the first civilization on planet Earth. And that on its own is frightening to a lot of people. And when you consider that civilizations may have come and gone, feeling this vulnerable on our planet, that's a place not many people really want to go. But the story of life on Earth is much longer. And I actually find that very exciting because there's so much more to learn.
But that's exactly the point. And most don't want, they think that this version of us right now is forever, right? And that's their comfort zone. The thought of what you mean we could have, it's possible we could only be around for 2,000 years, that we could actually have a nuclear war and end everything. The short answer is yes, right? We could. This all could end tomorrow. And this may have happened many times in the past, but people don't want to talk about that. They're not comfortable with that.
No, people are frightened of that. It makes us feel very vulnerable. But also the other side of it is if you say, well, did you know that our ancestors said that we could be smarter than this, that we can actually switch on more of our brains than this, and they had protocols to help us with that? A lot of people don't want to go there because of the fear of responsibility for a far bigger brain. I don't know what it is. Are we comfortable just being slaves and living a conventional life and then dying and then finding out after we've died what was really possible? I'm wired completely the other way. That when my ancestors say our ancestors were smarter and they had to dumb us down to be like this, they had to put things in the environment to dumb us down to be like this, that gives me an appetite to say, okay, how do I clean up my environment? How do I switch my brain on? And you've only got to study a few cases of acquired savant syndrome to be asking the question, can we be developing higher cognitive powers without brain injuries, so on and so forth? That's really where I'm going. That's what makes me excited.
Yeah, I laugh because the most spiritual person on planet Earth is the atheist physicist as the plane is going down. That's
Yes.
You know, and it's really true, and but yet there is this this safe zone that probably half of the planet, probably half, is okay with, that there's nothing to trip out on. This is all there is. There's nothing else. And that's my Pandora's box, Paul. I never want to have that thought. I never want to be that person.
No. This is why I love Plato so much. And Plato is very well aware that we all die, but he felt that the great purpose of life was to find out what's real, find out what's possible, to learn what he called Sophia, wisdom, and to have the best human experience that you could possibly have. And in the Eden Conspiracy, I say, how about we do that collectively? Can we have a better human experience as societies, as cultures? And our ancestors said, yes, we can.
Does it, we're going to take a break here in about 60 seconds. It's not a hard break, but if that becomes the case, as you so well put it, does that end the necessity of the Vatican or powers that need to control? If you take away that biggest question of all, then they lose the control that they need?
Yes, I think religious control has often been built on anxiety about this life and what comes next. And I think it's very positive to lose that anxiety and to lose that control. The Vatican still have a role because people will always want to know how to have a better human experience, how to connect with spiritual phenomena, how to switch on their higher cognitive faculties. And the Vatican's got a wonderful library that it can plumb to bring out some teaching on that. So there's always a place for spiritual teachers, and the Vatican can certainly do that. But I think any authority that seeks to manage people, control the narrative, control people through a religion that's based on anxiety about this life and what comes after, I think we've done that for long enough.
Stay right there. Our guest tonight, Paul Wallis. He's live from Queensland, Australia. We're going to take a quick break. This is Fade to Black. Stay with us. This is Jimmy Church of Fade to Black. Please visit all of our sponsors. We're taking a quick break here. All of the links are below. We'll be right back. This is Jimmy Church, and I want to introduce you to LifeWaves X39 Stem Cell Activation Patch, which has totally transformed my health, my sleep, brain, and my eyes. I no longer need reading glasses. X39 is a true breakthrough in regenerative science. Using light, X39's patented age reversal technology is clinically proven to signal the activation of younger stem cells, accelerating the body's natural healing process. X39 promotes restoration and rejuvenation, bringing the life-changing benefits that I've experienced. By naturally elevating a master signaling peptide in the body, X39 boosts vitality, health, and wellness, and resets 4,000 genes to a younger, healthier state. It's one patch, once a day, and you can turn back time with X39. Just go to healingworksnow.com. That's works with an X. healingworksnow.com.
Hey everybody, it's Billy Carson, also known as Forbidden Knowledge. I want to talk to you about a very special event coming up July 30th, 2023, the Forbidden Conscious Awards. We're going to honor people who have been contributing to the conscious community for decades. People that you know and love that have helped you get to higher levels of thought and consciousness and awareness. It's going to be a live in-person event, but seats are going to sell out very fast. You want to make sure you're there in person, and guess what? You can help vote for the winners. Voting is available on forbiddenknowledge.com, and the categories are going to be social media influencer, podcast/radio host, TV host, actor, director, producer, entrepreneurs, health and wellness, philanthropists, authors, field researchers, archaeologists, space anomaly hunters, and of course, a Lifetime Achievement Award. I'll be your keynote speaker that night at the Forbidden Conscious Awards. We have celebrity guests performing. We'll have a halftime show where we're actually going to perform music for you. And don't forget about the pre-event mixer, where if you buy a box seat, you'll be in the VIP section, and you also have private access to a VIP mixer with celebrity guests, shake hands, break bread, network, and then walk the red carpet with us and take amazing photos. It's going to be a night to remember. You don't want to forget this. Make sure you hurry up and get your tickets because they're selling out very fast. I want to see you there. Forbidden Conscious Awards 2023.
River Moon Coffee, makers of the Fade to Black blend. Truly the best coffee on planet Earth. Just visit rivermoonwellness.com or their Amazon store. It's all simple to do. You can check out the Fade to Black blend, the Game Changer blend, or any of their Black Moon wellness products. It's the only coffee I drink. It is the best, and it's Doc. Again, rivermoonwellness.com. All right. Welcome back, Fade to Black. I am your host, Jimmy Church, and tonight our guest is Paul Wallis, live from Queensland, Australia. People want to know how I got my vision back. You watch this show every day. You watched. I had glasses on. I couldn't see. I can see. It's X39. You've got to do it. I've got a patch. Look, right here on the back of my neck. There it is. It's the patch that I wear. I'm putting it back. Putting the patch back, putting it back. I don't want it off. But that's what I wear. It's on the back of my neck. Get your vision back. X39. The links are below. Our guest tonight, Paul Wallis. And Paul, great conversation. And this is what I want to turn a little bit here and talk about technology in the Bible. And the reason for that is I recently just got back from Egypt. And I talk about Egypt all the time, and I'm fascinated with it. But the one thing is the dogma that we are fed, which has become truth. Okay? And the dogma is this, that tribes Stone Age man wearing animal skins wandered out of the desert, and then a couple of weeks later built the Great Pyramid. That's the dogma. That's the dogma. And we are fed it over and over again that we buy into it. And it doesn't fit. And that's where high technology comes into play here. It wasn't a dirt ramp and palm trees. Something else is involved here. I don't know what it is, but the Bible is helping us, isn't it?
Yes, it is. I had exactly the same experience when I went to Egypt many years ago. And whenever you see the really interesting advanced artifacts, oh, that's pre-dynastic. Oh, what does that mean? Well, it's before the Egyptian history that we really know about. Okay, who were the pre-dynastic Egyptians? And as you say, the answer is, well, they were farmers. They were farmers, and then all of a sudden they produced technology that we don't know how they made it and that we could hardly replicate it. And it was more advanced than all the stuff that we know about. So there's no evolution of technology that can be pointed to. Now, what's interesting about the Bible is that when it gets to technology, the technology that's named does not belong to the humans. It belongs to somebody else, another civilization. And as we spoke earlier, it's really the stories of the sky people retold of the stories of the Elohim. In the Bible, the Elohim have the technology. So it's the Elohim called Yahweh in Exodus 33 who has that rocket. And by the way, we were saying earlier, do we have a better understanding of what we're looking at in the texts? I would say even post Elon Musk, we can understand Exodus 33 better. Because prior to Elon Musk and SpaceX, nobody could picture a Saturn V type rocket landing vertically, as it's described in Exodus 33. Now it's been done. It can land on a postage stamp. And we can simply read and take at face value what's described there. So that technology belongs to Yahweh in Exodus 33. There's other technology associated with him in the book of Ezekiel. And it's technology that includes flying technology, spacefaring technology that can arrive through wormholes, advanced weaponry in the book of Ezekiel, and then remote communications devices in the story of the Ark of the Covenant and the Urim and the Thummim. But in all these, there's a sense of mystery around the technology. Moses wants to see this technology that he's never seen before. Ezekiel is fascinated by this flying technology he's never seen before, and then terrified by the weaponry that he's never seen before. And when we get to the communications devices, the narrators who write about those in the Hebrew scriptures clearly do not know how they work and are describing something that perhaps even the priests and prophets of the time didn't know how they worked. And it's possible that what they'd actually done with the Urim and the Thummim, for instance, was to try and recreate technology they'd seen somebody else using. And that picture of ancient technology in the Bible mirrors what we find in other places. In the Popol Vuh, we have technology that's being described as if it were a creature. Or you go to there's a wonderful carving in Yashalan of Queen Shuk of the Jaguar dynasty using remote communication technology. But the way it's depicted, it looks like the carver knows what the thing is, knows what it does, but it's an approximation of technology that was seen. So all this suggests to me that ancient technology didn't have any evolution behind it because it came with visitors. It came with ETs.
Now, why is it just because it's an easy out when you hear different scholars look at what you're talking about? And I've got carvings here on the wall, by the way. I've got Mayan and Central American carvings on my walls that clearly show something pretty nuts. But they will say it's jewelry, right?
Yes.
it's ornamental. It's not
Yes.
what you think. Is that just their easy way out without explaining it themselves?
It's a half answer.
Right.
So when you go to Mexico or Guatemala and you look at the carvings of what the priest kings and queens wore, you and I will look and say, that's a space helmet, that's a Bluetooth. And then we ask the guide, how come they're wearing a Bluetooth? How come they're wearing breathing apparatus with that helmet? They will say, just as you said, oh no, that is what they wore as representations of their advancement and power. But the question is, why? Why does something that looks like breathing apparatus denote advancement and power? Why does something that looks like a Bluetooth and that is used in the place of the voices represent advancement and power? Why did they choose those images to show that they were advanced beings? Why did they wear brooches that look like aircraft? Why that symbol? And that's the question that isn't answered. But I would say it's a very democratizing age. And it's very right for people like you and me to go and allow ourselves to see what's right in front of us, to risk sounding dumb and saying, but doesn't that look like a single pilot aircraft? Doesn't that look like a Bluetooth? And yes, it does. If the explanation is these are representations of power, you have to say why. Why did Queen Shuk and the Jaguar dynasty reckon that wearing things that looked like that would make them look more advanced? And I think the answer is they were imitating a previous culture who had that technology, knew what it was, knew how to make it work.
Right. They saw it. And here's the thing. And we're going to swing it back to ancient Egypt. But when you look at these carvings, I'm tempted to pull something off of the wall. I won't do that. But when you look, and these kings or god, whatever who is depicted, hands on levers, feet on pedals, right? And tell me, what king was sitting on his throne, doing this stuff with this?
Well, I know. What are they depicting exactly? So, you go for an academic answer. What are they depicting? So you're describing the sarcophagus lid of King Pakal from Palenque.
It's right here.
You go to a what's the word for it? Somebody who studies symbology. Go to Linda Sheila, and she will say he is in a device that is transporting him through the Milky Way. As soon as Erich von Daniken repeats that and says that's what it is, Linda Sheila is suddenly really embarrassed. And she has to say, oh, I didn't mean it literally. That's what it is. That's what the picture is. But it doesn't mean it's anything real. I didn't mean to say it was anything real. But this is the role of the writer. This is the role I really revel in. It's saying, here's the data. We all agree that's the data. That's the picture, isn't it? You said this. Doesn't that mean this? Isn't the implication of that this? Why would people in ancient Mesoamerica want to depict their king traveling in a craft through the Milky Way? Answer me that. And that's when the answer gets vague, unless we're willing to accept they meant what they said, they meant what they drew, they meant it as it is. And now it's our turn to think through the implications of that.
In 1992, there was a great debate as the Sphinx started to get redated, right, by Dr. Robert Schoch and John Anthony West. And the debate started, and the position of the skeptics, professional geologists, I might add, was that there is no evidence of anything prior to 3000 BC. So show us anything, and then we can have a discussion. But until that point, everything stays the way it is. The Sphinx is staying with its dating. The Great Pyramid is, and then 3 years later, Göbekli Tepe. And Göbekli Tepe didn't predate Egypt by a couple of weeks. It predates Giza by 7,000 years.
Yes.
And in a way that I might argue is as elegant or more elegant than what the Egyptians were doing 7,000 years later, right?
Yes.
But it doesn't change the argument today. It doesn't change the dogma.
It should do. Göbekli Tepe is a profoundly important find for a number of reasons. I mean, the date, first of all, a megalithic society produced that site. And we're now realizing the site at Göbekli Tepe is far larger than even we first imagined. So again, you've got that question of hunter-gatherers. They're not even farmers at that point in our history, by our understanding. Hunter-gatherers have produced this megalithic site. That doesn't fit. It was in 1998 that Manfred Hoyne took a team to another part of Turkey, southeast Turkey, to Karakodag, where they identified what they strongly argued was the first known farm, the first where naturally occurring plants were turned into cultivatable crops, the first occurrence of animal husbandry. He took a team from the University of Az in Norway and the Max Institute in Cologne, Germany, and they studied that, and they said this great leap forward, which has so long fascinated archaeologists and anthropologists, happened here. And it was so local, it may have been a single family that suddenly genetically modified plants and do animal husbandry, and then it peppers up all around the world. So it was a very exciting find, the very first farm, the beginning of civilization as we know it, except a few hundred miles down the road, has built a megalithic site. Tell me how those go together. And it strongly suggests to me a pivot in human history, a pivot between two civilizations, one that is coming to the end of its time and carefully buries its remains, because that's what happened at Göbekli Tepe. And then there's a re-emergence in the same country as it is today in southeast Turkey. So one culture extincts, one re-emerges, and the timing is really suspicious because it is in the recovery from the Younger Dryas cold period that pivot is happening. Now this, I think, lends credence to what Graham Hancock talks about, where he talks about previous civilizations and the survivors of those seeding everything we know about. And I applaud him for his work in highlighting that. I accept that, and I go further and say, yes, but our ancestors were also very specific about what regions of space many of our helpers came from. And they named the Pleiades, Sirius, and Orion, and they named it all around the world. So just as at Göbekli Tepe, you've got images and motifs that can be found all around the planet, that explanation of the Great Leap Forward can be found all around the planet as well. And that's why I think we really need to do business with the ET aspect of the story.
Can I throw in one other wrench? May I?
You may.
Göbekli Tepe, the birthplace of Abraham. Is the biblical?
Ooh.
Right. And you throw that at not anywhere on the planet, right? Specifically that region right there. And the other part, so I want your response. I like you. Oh, yeah, I know, right? But is this the ability to construct Göbekli Tepe requires everything that anthropologists are in denial about? You need organization, you need a government, you need agriculture, you've got to clothe, you've got to feed, you have to have the technology, you have to have the knowledge of quarrying, you have to be artistic, you have to be able to think in 3D in your artwork. A lot of this is relief carving and 3D. And all of those things were not supposed to exist at
Exactly.
10,000 BC. And that's a whole lot of boxes to check, isn't it? And then throw in Abraham. Right.
Well, that's a great question, because Karakodag is supposedly the first farm, except the Great Leap Forward had obviously already happened thousands of years prior for Göbekli Tepe to be there. So you've got a series of beginnings of civilization, and we're beginning to echo what we said earlier that's described in the Bible. Now, Abraham is certainly a story of beginnings in the Bible. Where it occurs in the canon as it is now, it's the beginning of Jewish history. I would suggest that embedded in the story of Abraham and Sarah is an even more ancient story than that. Even more ancient than the great leap forward with regard to agronomy. If you go further east to India, you will hear the stories of Brahma and Saraswati, the progenitors of the human race. Brahma, Saraswati, those names sound rather familiar, don't they? Abraham, Sarah, and Abraham is honored as the father of, and we usually say the father of many nations, except only 2 nations are named in the Bible, where you've got Ishmael and Isaac, the Arabic peoples, the Semitic peoples, but it says many nations. What if Abraham is the father of the many nations? Suddenly you realize it's a parallel story to Brahma, the father of humanity. And there's a clue in the Bible that it is a story of human origins, not just Jewish origins, that we find in Abraham and Sarah. First of all, they are a couple that's not going to have children. They have children after a close encounter experience. And 2 generations after, you've got 2 different kinds of human being in their bloodline. You've got the smooth-skinned, clever, sophisticated one. And then you've got one who's much bigger and stronger and covered in red hair. And the smooth-skinned human being has to work out how to get dominance over the environment. Well, that to me sounds like a story from a time when there was more than one kind of hominid, more than one kind of human on the Earth's surface, and the smooth one had to work out how to get dominance. That's a story of human origins. So putting all that together, Abraham, Sarah, Brahma, Saraswati, 2 kinds of humans, you realize that Abraham and Sarah is every bit as much a story of beginnings as the story of Adam and Eve, as the story of Noah and his family and the repopulation. And I would suggest that all those stories are about the reset of civilization on Earth. And Göbekli Tepe, adjacent to Karakadag, is hard copy evidence of one planetary reset, the most recent one from about 10,000 years ago. And once you've seen one, you realize that many are possible.
Shouldn't Göbekli Tepe, I mean, at least to this point, be the most important discovery in the history of humankind up until now? There's many more to be discovered, but it is certainly dramatic. And
Yes.
I'm very surprised that the media and the educational system hasn't changed their focus. I think it's that important, isn't it?
It is. It is, because it does more than throw a huge question mark over everything we thought we knew about the history of the human race and human development. It really does. So you're right. Archaeologically, it is the most important find, potentially alongside one other. And that was the find of Gilgamesh's tomb in 1993. Because there we had the opportunity to scientifically test what I said earlier, that there's an ET aspect to the story of the Great Leap Forward. If that was Gilgamesh's tomb, then we could test whatever's there for any evidence that it was something other than a human being in that sarcophagus. And it was Jörg Fassbinder who made that find through soil magnetization. And it could have been the find not only of the century, but of all time, to be able to test that. Were the Sumerian sky people fact or fiction? And having found it, and it was so important that within days of going into Iraq in the incursion of 1993, there was a militarily protected archaeological dig to retrieve that sarcophagus, and then silence. No more mention of it. Nothing mentioned until a few years later when Jörg Fassbinder says we decided not to investigate any further, thought it would be safer to bury the site. That is just not logical. You don't go to the effort of getting a militarily guarded archaeological expedition into Iraq days after invading and then change your mind. I think the logic says we got it, we tested it. We didn't want to test it in public in case the finds were too earth-shattering. If the result was not earth-shattering, we would publish it. But since nothing has been published, I think something was found. I think put that alongside Göbekli Tepe and you have really retold the whole story of humanity.
I believe, and by the way, we're going to circle back to communication devices. I meant to do that a while ago. Conversation is too fascinating. It's going to go where it's going to go organically. But it's this. Out of all of the evolutionary points that got us here, I think one of the most important is the domestication of wheat. And it is, from a scientific standpoint, insane
Yes.
to think through this. But we are also suggesting here that it was some dude barefoot in the middle of the desert, instead of out hunting and gathering and helping his family survive. His wife comes up and says, "Hey, we got to feed the kids." And he says, "I got an idea here." Right?
Yeah. I've been splicing genes.
Yeah. Give me a minute. I'm close.
Yeah.
That to me is something that was taught, right?
Oh, yes. I think
and with that idea.
Definitely. I think it is the most obvious conclusion to reach when you look at what had to be done to change a naturally occurring grass into wheat as we know it, cultivatable wheat. You have to alter 2 genes. Okay, so hence my joke that he hadn't gone out hunter-gathering because he was splicing genes. That's what he had to do. He had to alter 2 genes just to produce wheat. And at Karakadag, he modified, this barefoot dude, modified 11 naturally occurring plants. Now, to put that in perspective, I lived on the farm that belonged to William Farrer. Now, if you don't know the name William Farrer, he is the guy who produced Federation wheat. That was the kind of wheat that was able to grow in the harsh climate of Australia. So the Brits got here, took over. Rather than learning from the Aboriginal Australians, they want to reinvent the wheel and find wheat that they can cultivate in Australia. None of the European strains can do it. So it has to be altered. It took William Farrer, who was the son of a farmer. He'd grown up in farming and he had all the advantages of 19th century science to work out how to modify wheat that was already cultivatable to produce Federation wheat. Took him 20 years with all those advantages to say, I've done it to 1 plant. I've changed British wheat into Federation wheat. 20 years. And yet this barefoot dude in Karakadag can do that 11 times over in his spare time when he's not busy surviving. It's ridiculous.
It blows my mind. And I don't, it's kind of like a case, Paul, if you will, of Occam's razor, because the story that we are told is complex, right? It wasn't. He was just taught. Somebody came in and showed him what to do.
Yes.
You are not, and I'm serious about this, literally wearing animal skins, wondering how you are going to survive the night with your family and wake up in the morning alive. And you're going to be that person and then turn around and start genetically splicing organic material to domesticate.
Exactly.
No.
Or take the kidney bean. I mean, the kidney bean is poisonous if you pick it up off the ground and eat it. So was it that same barefoot dude who, having nearly poisoned his family, says, let's eat these again, but boil them for 12 minutes first? I mean, you don't get there through guesswork. You have to be helped. And the fact is, our ancestors all around the world say we had help. They just say it like it is. Our ancestors were visited. The Aboriginal Australians in the Northern Territory, the Yolngu people will say the Mimi people taught us how to farm and how to live off the land. Cherokee people will say people came from the Pleiades who taught us these things. Asherah from the Pleiades in the Bible taught our ancestors these things. And that is an explanation that makes sense. We don't have an explanation outside of what our ancestors said. And do we really have a reason to question it? Why would they invent that story? It doesn't glorify them.
It's the same thing with our chromosome count and chromosome pairs, and how Homo sapiens are Homo sapiens, and there was so much information in 2 pairs of chromosomes, but we're missing those 2. But primates have it. So why aren't they the ones developing the internet and nuclear weapons? Right?
Yes, that's right. And it is such a precise alteration that raises huge questions. So I think I don't understand this, because surely academics make their living by asking big questions and then writing books and papers to answer them. Wouldn't it be interesting to have some bigger questions on the table once again?
But that's it. And I think that history, far history in the future, is going to prove us to be on the right side of the fence here. And I'm not here to embarrass people or anything. I'm just trying to get to the answers to these questions. And what I have been taught just doesn't make any sense. And that's all that I'm saying. When we look at the Sumerian text, and it clearly states the answers to everything that we have been very perplexed about, it's like the Occam's razor thing. Maybe the simplest answer here is the right one. Why make this so complex? Or say that you don't know.
Or if all you did was take the overlap of story from ancient Sumeria and Guatemala and Mexico and Nigeria and the Zulu people and ancient Greece and the Norse stories and the Vedic story, if all you took was the overlap, you would have a coherent picture about who we are and where we came from.
But and here's the thing, though. If we look back at like the story of Noah, and you brought this up earlier, it was called Noah, right? The movie that came out like 10 years ago.
That's right, with Russell Crowe.
Yeah, that's it. That's why I didn't remember. Oh man, is that? I'm being kind. Is that they took special care to respect the Bible in the writing of that screenplay. You take the Bible out and you're watching E.T. Contact. That's what the watchers. That's exactly what's being depicted in that movie. Although they were trying to respect the Bible as it sat. It was a very interesting picture to watch. There was a huge E.T. Contact storyline there.
Yes, there was. And it would be very interesting for anyone who knew the Sumerian stories to watch the Russell Crowe Noah as well, because there is an acknowledgement in the Sumerian telling of the Noah story of contact experiences being part of what happened and why it happened. So it's even more interesting to rewatch that when you've read the Sumerian texts.
Now, can we go back to, you mentioned communication devices. What specific story in the Bible talks about this?
So the Ark of the Covenant is this fascinating piece that is constructed for the leaders of the tribes of Israel to perform things that look like technological feats. So the Ark seems to be able to generate vortices of wind, for instance, which is interesting on its own. It's the vested object of of Israelite society, which means it represents the authority to govern, and that hints at it belonging to the powers that governed before. But Moses is told that when this device has been constructed according to precise instructions, when he is seated near it, that is when he will get communication from Yahweh. And that therefore what the leader says when he's sat adjacent to the ark has to be believed implicitly and obeyed implicitly. And it runs in parallel with other vested object stories from around the world. So you can go to, Queen Shuk is another example. When she's in the place of the voices wearing that thing that looks like a Bluetooth, she's getting communication from the feathered serpents. And therefore what she says must be believed and must be obeyed. So you've got that parallel there. Or you can go to the country of my fathers on my father's side, Ghana. You've only got the right to govern over the Ashanti people if you're seated on this particular device called the Golden Throne, very similar to the Ark of the Covenant. And what's curious is that all these stories associate the power to speak authoritatively and to govern with an intelligence that's absent, that's in some other place, some other dimension. So the feathered serpents are who knows where, but Queen Shuk's getting communication. Yahweh is who knows where, but when you're seated by the Ark of the Covenant, you're getting communication and you can reign in his name. And we've got a little echo of that going on in 2023. King Charles III is going to be crowned seated above the stone of destiny, the stone of scone or scone. Now, it's used for the crowning of English kings and queens because it gives them the authority to govern over Scotland, because it's their vested object. It was used for the coronation of Scottish kings. And then before then, it was in Ireland, and it was used for the coronation of Irish kings. And before it was in Ireland, it was in the Middle East, and the story goes, it was part of the standing stones that Jacob built at the place where he experienced close encounters. So this is a bizarre story. King Charles is basing his authority to rule over Scotland because he's got an object that comes from a place that experienced close encounters with beings from outer space, coming down from space, going back up into space. Jacob builds the standing stones, and now we've got a bit of it. So why is a sovereign in the 21st century, again, associating his authority to rule with an ET-based story?
Because it's true. Because it's true. Why?
And because our whole experience of governance goes back to that time when we were governed by the ETs who met Jacob in Bethel, so on and so forth, or the ETs who used the Bluetooths in Guatemala, or the ETs who crafted the original Ark of the Covenant in the Levant. It's part of the same pattern.
Like I said, because it's true.
Because it's true. Yeah.
There's I try to keep religion out of my show and politics. You can't avoid, but it's the conspiracy of religion that I will talk about all day long. And that's not conspiracy in a criminal sense. Well, kind of. But in this case, where we cannot ignore the facts here. Right. And if we follow the chain of custody of that stone all the way back, it goes back to the Middle East. It doesn't come from the plains of, it doesn't come from Salisbury Hill. Right. It doesn't come from Berry. It comes from the Middle East and from an origin story that evolves something not of this earth. I don't want to say ET, but it could be anything. But that's the chain of custody.
Yes, and even if that weren't true, even if it were found that the stone of scone really did come from Salisbury and the whole story was made up, why does a sovereign in the 21st century want to root his authority in an ET narrative? And it is because of this pattern. And I think it's because of our cultural memory that originally we were governed by beings not of this earth who then handed over authority to human successors. That's the story of Gilgamesh, the crossover king. It's the story told by the Nigerian people, the Efik people, who talk about the Ojisu, the original rulers from the heaven, who then handed authority over to the Oba. You can find that story repeating in the Vedic stories, an Egyptian story. It's a universal story. Authority to rule comes from off-planet. And the human position holders, well, they're just human position holders. That's the big picture. And it's there in the Bible too.
Now, here, I'll upset the other half of the audience that I haven't upset yet tonight, which is, and then you have the pilgrimage in Mecca, right? And to get to a piece of rock that came from off planet, that's crazy. I mean, that's it. When you read the chain of custody story behind that, and you see what it looks like. It very much mirrors what's about to happen at the coronation.
Yes, it does. What I find in the Bible is really interesting, and this is in my new book, The Eden Conspiracy, is that there was a time, the 8th century BCE, when the kings wanted to get rid of all those objects and all those places of pilgrimage, because there were so many throughout the Levant. There were so many standing stones marking places of contact. There were so many carvings representing the beings who came in the past. And they wanted to pare all that down, get rid of that, except the information is still there in the text of the Bible saying this was the pattern, this was our cultural memory. And that's why I think the Bible is such an important document. I think it's one of the most detailed depictions of paleocontact in our written record, which is why I keep going back to it in my books and saying, look at this.
Exactly. Now, okay, can we talk about the Prime Directive?
Sure.
There's a reason why I'm going to tie Star Trek into all of this. And it's this, Paul, the Prime Directive. If you and I went out on a starship and we found cavemen, a civil, the startings of something intelligent, are we, and they're still trying to, rub two stones together and start a fire. Are you and I going to toss them a Bic lighter, right? And go, dude, it's much easier than that. Here, check this out.
Well, look, if we wanted to be worshipped as gods, we might do that. Look at this.
It's a really good point, right?
I can make fire.
Yeah, their God would have glasses. With ET's contact with us, which apparently has been going on for probably as long as Earth has been around, what's the intention of that contact? Because it seems like there has been help, a lot of it. We just talk about the domestication of wheat, for example. But should the Prime Directive come into play? What's the real mission of ET then?
That's a great question. It was Christmas 2020, just before, when Haim Eshed stepped forward and met the press. He was the brigadier general who for 27 years was Israel's chief of space security. So it was his job to know about these things. And he said on the basis of his knowledge, his understanding is that we've been in contact with a galactic federation for a long time at a covert government level, but it has chosen not to self-disclose until you and I have a better understanding of what space is and what spaceships are. That was his phrase, very intriguing phrase. Now, when he said that, I am just disappointed that the world's press didn't take a lot more notice of that, because it was a very credible person coming out with the story and not a new story. The stories there in the Bible, in the Sumerian, in the Vedic, in the Nordic stories, so on and so forth. Chosen not to self-disclose. I think that's true. So we can get very frustrated with the US government, for instance, in having so much classified information that it won't disclose, or the Vatican has so much classified it won't disclose. But I believe that policy of non-disclosure has not been set at the human level. It's been set up here. Why? What's the agenda? Well, the fact that it's a federation reminds us that it's a plurality of demographics who are interested in Project Earth. And the Bible says the same. There was a whole range of beings who came in the past, some to help, some to nurture, but others to exploit and to colonize. There was a whole spectrum of experiences of paleocontact. And unfortunately, it's the positive kind that's kind of got forgotten. And we remember the traumatic stories. And, you know, often when you say the word aliens, people will immediately think Mars attacks, invasion of the body snatchers, Independence Day. They won't think tuition in agronomy, you know, helping us to build better farms or live more sustainably. But that's all part of the spectrum. Then you've got, you mentioned Genesis 6 earlier in our conversation, stories of hybridization. So there's a whole spectrum of agendas. Some are here to help because they love human beings and they want to nurture human civilization. Some are here because they like humans and they want more of what we've got in their gene pool. So there's the hybridization program. We hear of it in Genesis 6. We hear of it in the Book of Enoch and in other narratives around the world. And then we've got others here for exploitation. Those who used our ancestors in the mines 200,000 years ago, for instance. The reason there's a federation is because there is disharmony and conflict and a variety of agendas, and they are sitting in some kind of an uneasy agreement or truce. Only there's a bit of leakage. We say prime directive, but people are having contact experiences all the time, and we always have. So that suggests to me that the agreement of non-disclosure is not watertight. And it's a little bit less watertight now than it's been for a long time.
What's the next step, though? Is the next step us or them? Right? Something's got, you know what I mean? Something's got to give. And I don't know if it shows like this, authors and researchers like yourself, and you're a host and a media presenter yourself. Is it up to us, or is it ET? Is it our government? What's the next step in this?
Well, my hope is that the future is not set in stone. And I don't believe it is. And I think that's why we have leakage. That's why we have a push and pull, even at a human level, you know, among our intelligence and government authorities, military authorities. How much disclosure should there be? This much or this much? And there's this push and pull going on. I think that's happening on the galactic federation level as well, to use Hayam-Ashed's language. Personally, I have an old-fashioned belief in democracy and a love of democracy. And what that means is I want to know who's representing us in those conversations, in whose interests are decisions being made, who are our friends on that council, with whom can we do good exopolitics. And my hope is that there are enough friends in high places that we can chart a positive way forward for humanity. I think a lot of people are very anxious about what the powers that be have in mind for us around the planet in the future decades. Well, my hope is that the outcomes are not set in stone, that there are still conversations going on, that we do have friends in high places, and that contact is not only at a covert government level, as Hayam-Ashed said. People all around the world are having contact experiences and communication experiences. And I think we need to embrace that instead of ridiculing it, make the most of information that is flowing to us in that way, because I think that's our best hope of charting a positive way forward where we're not the victims, where we're not constantly lied to or manipulated. We need to get ourselves in the picture as best we can. And that's why I love shows like yours, Jimmy, conversations like this, because it is bringing more and more people into the conversation. And I think information is power. The more we know, the more hope we have of being players in our own future.
Who would best represent us? Would it be science, physicists like Brian Greene, or would it be the Pope? Would it or Matthew McConaughey, right?
Yeah, I was going to say Jodie Foster. We're talking about contact, aren't we?
Yeah, I put Jodie up on that list. I wouldn't have any issues with that at all. But who would best represent us? Would it be science? Would it be math, religion, philosophy? Hopefully not a politician. But
Yes, that's why I say I hope it's not only at a covert government level, and I don't think it is. I don't think we have to, single it down to saying if we have to pick one, let's pick a social entrepreneur or a religious leader, because contact is far more plural than that. I mean, the movie, it's so fascinating. The movie Contact was written by Carl Sagan, who officially didn't believe we were in contact. He was an absolute skeptic about that. Officially, is very skeptical about contact in the deep past until you read all the papers he wrote in the 1960s, and then you watch the movie that was produced from his novel. I think even if he didn't think he could present it as science, he presented it as a story for the world to know about the idea of contact. And that novel wrestles with this question: who should represent us? Should it be a religious person? Should it be a scientific person? And that whole debate is had in the movie. But my hope is it's not down to an individual community or a single individual. Contact is going on in every country, in every culture around the world. Regular human beings are having contact experiences. Children are having them. Our politicians are having them as well, because I think our visitors have the intelligence to know that to have a communication with us, it needs to be in that plural way. And there's no way of having a conversation with humanity unless it's done in that plural way. So that gives me some hope.
With Giorgio Tsoukalos, with his extreme popularity these days, and it's totally awesome.
Good for him.
The meme, right? It's aliens. Well, Ancient Aliens has done an awful lot, Erich von Daniken in general, to force the questions. That's all, right? But if we go back and start to adjust things and look at the past, has it been an ET alien influence on just about everything? If we stop and take a look at it, we can say God, we can say angels, we can say heavens, we can insert any narrative we want into this. But is that the case? And if it is that the problem moving forward, like contact?
Yes, how much interference has happened? If interventions have happened at the level of shaping us as a species, that suggests a very hands-on relationship, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And there was a book written a long time ago now by a Presbyterian minister called Robert Kirk in the 1600s. Now, Presbyterian minister, people should straight away know that means a very conservative individual. That's a very conservative kind of Christianity. But Robert Kirk was a parish minister and a man of great intelligence and compassion who listened to the locals and their experience of life in Aberfoyle, Scotland. And as he listened to them, he realized he was hearing about a hybridization program that was going on by non-humans interfacing with human beings. And as he followed that white rabbit, he reached the conclusion that there is a non-human layer to the governance of humanity all around the world. And it's been in place for a very long time. And he published that book, which is an incredibly courageous thing to do. But he was in fact repeating what indigenous cultures have said since time immemorial, that no understanding of the world is complete until you recognize there is a non-human layer to our government. And I argue in the Eden Conspiracy that the Bible teaches us that in their original forms, the biblical narratives are teaching us about covert government, hidden hands in our political and economic life, and the fact that that hidden hand is an ET hand. They too believed you won't understand what's going on You won't understand why the position holders behave in the way they do until you realize there's a non-human layer to the uber policies that run everything. Doesn't necessarily mean that every single policy was decided by an ET authority, but some. And when we're mystified by decisions that are taken that appear to have the interests of ordinary human beings nowhere in view, I think there's a very big clue there's an ET hand in that decision, whether it's decisions to do with banking, money supply, warfare, public health. Very often we see things that don't make sense from a human perspective, and our ancestors say, no, it won't make sense. There is a council perpetually debating how many human beings there should be on the planet, how long-lived they should be, how healthy they should be, what access to information they should have, what access to clean water, safe foods, medications. That's reported in the Bible by cultures all around the world, and they're the same struggles we're having today. We're experiencing culture wars, not only around medicine, but around farming. And I would argue these culture wars all have their roots in the non-human layer, in the conflicts of that galactic federation, to use Hermeshed's language.
Profound, Paul, profound. Where can everybody chase you down? Is it as simple as paulanthonywallis.com?
You can find me there. If you're looking for coaching, you can find me there. You can find all my books there. You can go to Amazon, where you'll find all my Eden titles. And you can find me at fifthkind.tv, the Fifth Kind TV on YouTube, and the Paul Wallis Channel on YouTube as well.
Man, I can't wait to get you back on the show. I waited too long for this, but it was a brilliant night. Thank you so much, Paul. Be safe.
Thanks, Jimmy.
And again, happy birthday.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
The absolute very best, Paul Wallis. And again, Paul's links are below. We've got them over on the website, and we've got them throughout social media. It is Fifth Kind, that's with a 5, fifthkind.tv, and paulanthonywallis.com. I'm your host, Jimmy Church, and I've got to get out of here. We just went pole to pole with Paul. Excellent conversation tonight. Thank you so much. And what have I got going on tomorrow? Does anybody know? Tomorrow night is, Dave Schrader. Tomorrow night, right here on Fade to Black, everybody. Dave Schrader tomorrow night. It is going to be great. Thank you, Paul. Again, paulanthonywallis.com. Fade to Black is produced by Hilton J. Palm, Renee Newman, and Michelle Freed. Thank you to Dennis and Kevin. Webmaster is Drew the Geek. Music, Doug Aldrich. Intro, Spaceboy. SpaceboyMusic.com. Fade to Black is produced by Jimmy Church. Fade to Black is produced by KJCR for the Game Changer Network, and this broadcast is owned and copyrighted 2023 by Fade to Black and the Game Changer Network, Inc. It cannot be rebroadcast, downloaded, copied, or used anywhere in the known universe without written permission from Fade to Black or the Game Changer Network. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. Until tomorrow night with Darkness Dave, I want you to be safe. Go Backley Tappy.